Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my tutorial on how to paint terrain in Crusader Kings 3. I'm going to go ahead and start from the very beginning. If you're more of an advanced user, if you know how to launch into debug mode and you know the basics of map painting, check out timestamps in the description below to skip ahead to the part that interests you. But if you're brand new, not a problem. We're going to start from the beginning, which starts in the launcher. So from the launcher, we need to get to our debug mode, which we get to through game settings over here, not launcher settings, but game settings, and then click open game in debug mode. This launches the game with a couple of tools, extra tools. There's another way to get into the map editor, which you might see online, and that is by changing the Steam params. I would suggest against it because by doing it this way, you can enter and exit the map editor at will. If you do the other one by changing your launch params through Steam, you can't. So once you're in, you go ahead and do new game or continue. I don't think it would make a difference. And so I'm doing this on my mod, which is work in progress, mod based on Terraform Mars. It'll look different than yours, but the basics apply. Once you're in, you're going to go ahead and hit tilde or backtick if you're on an international keyboard. It's the one to the left of the 1 key. Brings up your debug console. The only thing we care about is getting into the map editor. So you type map_editor, or if you've already used the command before, you can hit up on the arrow key. Brings up your last command used and hit enter. That'll load the map editor. The first time you load the map editor, it does take a little bit of time, so don't stress if you have a not so great of a machine. It might take a little bit. So that's it. We're now into the map editor. That's launching done. Give you a quick tour of the kind of painting that we will be doing. So I mostly emulate the Paradox style. Obviously my game or my mod is set on Mars, so there's a couple of extra textures that I use to give it a bit of flavor. But in general, I am going to be showing you how to emulate Paradox's style of painting. Alright, let's get started. I'm gonna paint, I think, this area here. I think it's pretty interesting. It's got this nice crater, which is pretty cool looking, some good hills, some mid plains, good mix, shoreline, all of that. So this is what we're going to paint. Now, in terms of tools, there's a couple of tools over on this left-hand side menu here, but there's really only two that you'll use for painting purposes. That is the material brush, which is the vast majority of the work that you'll do, and then you have the map object painter, which is for trees, other foliage. We're going to look at the material brush first. So if you click the material brush, you get your list of materials on the right here. This is how you paint. If you wanted to, you could just get started right away by selecting material. We'll go with plain 01 because it's the first one, and click and drag and paint away, and there you go. You've already started painting the map. Looks fine. Looks better than nothing, I suppose. Looks better than the beach. We'll get it looking even better than this though. When you have this brush open, so you can see the brush is that red circle. It has 3 settings, which you can access by right-clicking. That is amount, size, and hardness. So amount is like opacity. You can see the difference if I do, so there's amount 1. If I bring the opacity down, do it next to it, well, actually, you can see if I do it once, there's way less of it, barely any, in fact. If I do opacity, I don't know, 50%, you can see it just less. And if you keep clicking, eventually it'll build up to the same level. There is size. This slider only goes from 1 to 10, which is a bit annoying, but you can always input your own numbers here, and if you hold control and use your scroll wheel, you can change the size smoothly like that. I think 10 is probably a good place to start, so we'll stay there. And then the last one is hardness. So if I do full amount at 0 hardness, click once there, and then do maximum hardness, you can see the difference quite clearly. This one peters out, kind of blends around the edges, whereas this one does not. It's actually even more evident if I do a really big size. Let's do a really big size with hardness 0. You can see that kind of fades out really nicely, doesn't it? Whereas if I do hardness of max, it does not fade at all. Those are the only things that you actually need to know. Everything that Paradox does in terms of their map painting is done by combining textures using these 3 settings. Now, I almost always use hardness at 0. I would go ahead and set your hardness to 0 and forget about it until there's a use case for it to go above 0, but keeping it at 0 is fine. Almost everything that you'll do is going to be through amount. Now, there is another tool, like I said, for trees. That is the Map Object Painter. It's almost exactly the same. You can, if you right click, you get the same things. The only difference is instead of painting textures, you are painting foliage. I like Tree Leaf 02 personally, and yeah, you're going to go ahead and do some trees. If you want to put down a lot of trees at once, bigger size, sure, there you go. Alright, so we're back into our material brush. We know how the tools work. You might just go ahead and say, all right, cool, I know how it works now, great. And you're going to go into your terrain, you're going to paint down some plains, you're going to say, okay, I've got some hills, there's a hill texture here, Hill 01 rocks, cool. Let's just go ahead and paint these rocks, and yeah, we're going to call, yeah, nice, done. I mean, that doesn't look too bad, but it doesn't look great. And if you compare it to Paradox's, it doesn't really look anything like Paradox's terrain. The reason why is because Paradox uses, I would say, two ideas. That is, first of all, having a palette, and second of all, layers. It's all about layers. And I don't mean layers like in Photoshop where you actually have individual layers. I mean layers like actually painting. Like painting on top of things, then painting on top of things, which is how I think oil paints are done. So let's start with your palette. Your palette is a really important decision because it conveys a lot about both the tone of your mod in general and the climate of your mod. So for me, for example, when I talk about palette, so if I go to kind of the more fertile areas of Mars, my palette uses a lot of green. There's still a little bit of dustiness because this is Mars that we're talking about, but it's very green compared to the palette of drier, higher areas, which use a lot of yellows and reds. It's important, I think it's very important, that before you start painting, you explore all of the textures. I mean, literally every single one that's available to you here. There's not that many of them, so you should be able to go through them. Get a sense for how they look, how they feel. It's going to be pretty obvious in some cases. You know, these plains textures, plains 01, plains 01 rough, looks almost exactly the same. Plains 01 noisy. They're good for really verdant, really vibrant and fertile areas. Whereas if you scroll down to steppe grass, not so vibrant, a little bit drier, a little bit scrubbier. Same thing with the steppe rocks. A good middle ground, which Paradox uses a whole lot in vanilla, and one that I suggest you get very familiar with, is Medigrass 01. Even though it is Medi, which stands for Mediterranean, they use it everywhere. They use it, you know, all the way up to like Scandinavia and the British Isles, and I think they even use it in India in some places. So it is a really nice texture that is kind of a middle ground between super verdant and a little bit drier. And it's a good base. I would say use Medigrass in general as your base. So for me, I use Medigrass as my base almost everywhere. You can see if I go up to one of the more fertile areas, if you hold Alt, you actually get to see all of the different textures that make up a cell. And I think cells are only a couple of pixels across, but you can see Medigrass is almost always my number one. At some point it gets supplanted by hills, or maybe so I've got some drylands over here. Of course here I've got farmlands. But Medigrass, even down here where it's a bit drier, Medigrass is still going to be often in my, you can see it highlighted in yellow there, it's going to be in my palette. Medigrass is a good place to start if you want to emulate the Paradox style. If you don't, play around. But we are going to be emulating Paradox, so I'm going to go ahead and start with Medigrass as a base. Just going to go ahead and paint this whole area here because that's more or less what I want to paint. We're going to zoom in. All right. So I said the first idea was palette. The second idea is layers. Layers, and that's what most of this tutorial is going to be about, actually. The way that you build up really nice looking textures, and the way that Paradox does it, at least, is by doing small amounts in many layers. If we start with Medigrass, I mean, this looks decent, right? But we're going to want to do these hills. Like I showed before, we could select hills rocks and just slather that on, but it's not great. It doesn't, that's not realistic, right? It doesn't just all of a sudden change from grass into hills. You need more subtlety, more texture, more elegance to it. So I'm going to Control Z. The way that painting works, if you're emulating Paradox style, is you're going to change your amount to something really low. In general, I work between probably about 0.5 on the very, very extreme to up about 0.15, sorry, 0.05 to 0.15. 0.1 is a good place to start. It seems low, but trust me, that's where you want to be. And the trick to making things look good is just spamming that left click button and pulling out texture. This gives you a lot of control, and it blends in really nicely with the other textures. So you can already see, I mean, compared to what I just painted with that really hard amount, that looks way better. That's blended in really nicely. You can see the rocks just peeking out in some places. You can see, you know, then the rocks come out, but then they disappear again, they come out again. That looks really good. So that's the trick. I mean, if you were looking for one solid trick, you've learned it. Go ahead, set your amount to 0.1, take some textures, and start really clicking away. That is how you get good textures. Some textures look better with other textures than with other textures. Weird sentence. So hills look pretty darn good with Medigrass. So if I use this Hill 01 rock small, which is a bit of a tighter rock texture, and I do the same thing, and I just kind of click out, you can see they push out really nicely from underneath that grass. The reason why they push out so nicely is because each texture has height data associated with it. So on this hills texture, you can kind of see logically where it would be higher and where it would be lower. And that is exactly what the game does. So if I then paint over this hill with Medigrass on a low amount, rational parts of it start filling in with grass before other parts. And that's because there's height data on those textures. Now, not all textures play well together. So if you have Medigrass here and you think, okay, cool, I want to add a little bit more verdancy to it, a bit more green, you might think, okay, I'm going to go to Plains. I'm going to do what he said. I'm going to take this down to 0.1. I'm going to just start to click in really nice. And you might think, oh, well, that looks a bit not great. It's quite blobby. They don't really blend together so much as they fade. We want a nice kind of intermeshing. Oops. We don't want them to just transition from one to another with opacity. I mean, that looks like almost like a gradient. That's not what we want. You just have to play around to figure out which textures work well with other textures. The trick is really play around. I can tell you, because I've played around quite a bit, that Hills 01 works a lot better. So you can see that has a little bit of height data to it, and if you look at the edges there, it just blends away really nicely between the two textures. And if you zoom out, I mean, that looks pretty darn good, right? Play with your textures. Just find an empty area of your map, do one, do the other, see how they intermesh. You will figure it out, and the more you play around with it, the better you'll get at painting. I can also tell you that there's a bunch of other ones in the Medi section that look really good with Medigrass. Northern Plains looks pretty good with Medigrass if you want to bring in a kind of slightly less saturated version of Hills. I think that brings in really well. So we might want to add just a bit more greenery to this area. I think Medigrass is a bit too dry for what I want to achieve here. So I'm just going to bring in some Northern Plains by spamming that. And then, yeah, so there we go. That's a really nice way to bring a bit of subtlety into our grass. Another one that works really well is Medi Noisy Grass. I love this one. I use this one all over because it's got great height data to it. I just click twice, right? And you can see it just brings out some beautiful texture. Do it in a couple of places. Way more texture, way more interesting than kind of the default painter, which is, the novice painter will just start with that and say, that doesn't look very good. And the reason why is you've got to build up texture. Layers, 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 layers. So if I hold down Alt, you can see right here I've got 4 layers already. Northern Plain, Medigrass, Hill 01 Rock Small, and Medi Noisy Grass. And it looks pretty darn good, in my opinion, if I do say so myself. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a bit of a time lapse, and I'm going to paint out this whole area. Hopefully it looks good at the end, we'll see. And then I will bring us back after the time lapse to go over hills, forests, and rivers, and beaches. Alright, I'll see you on the other side of the time lapse. Alright, cool. It's not perfect, but I think it looks pretty good. One thing it's desperately missing, however, is trees. So, two ways to do trees. What you can do is you can start out with the trees by going to your map object painter, selecting your tree. I like tree leaf 02. I use it pretty exclusively. I suggest that when you're doing trees, I personally prefer using maximum hardness for this one and a maximum amount, and then just kind of doing size. I find that if you try to use amount the way that you do for terrains, it ends up doing this too standard of a distribution. You can kind of see it's almost like a matrix there. I don't think that looks very good. So my solution is just to go max amount, max hardness, and then use your size to kind of draw in where you want your trees. And you can do, little clicks to get a couple clusters of trees. And if you want literally one tree, you can press X to get to your eraser tool, and then just erase a single tree at a time. And then there you go, there's your one tree. But yeah, in general, I think high amount, high hardness when it comes to trees. When it comes to reeds and steps, play around with it. It's up to you. I generally do the same, but it is a bit more forgiving with reed and step bushes. Right, so anyways, back to trees. I'm going to go ahead and delete these ones. Let's say that I want to add some trees here. So I'm going to go ahead and do just that. I'm going to add these trees. All right, cool. That looks pretty good. That's a good place for the trees, right? The problem is, if you zoom out, what you'll notice happens, if I go ahead and reach a certain point, they disappear. They're gone. That's not good. You want your trees to be visible from past a certain amount, past the LODs. Some trees, some really big trees, I think if you use tree leaf 01, some of the really big trees do have LODs, but they look a bit weird. They're like not even a pixel in diameter. So what you have to do when you're using trees is you need to do a sort of fake tree underbrush. So if I go back to my brush tool, you can see there are these three textures: forest leaf, forest jungle, and forest pine. I'm going to use forest leaf, makes the most sense, right? So you can do your trees first, and then you can paint forest leaf. I might even do a pretty high amount here. You can paint forest leaf underneath them, and that is a perfectly valid way of doing it. So just so you know what forest leaf looks like, if I just draw it, you can see it's sort of like a fake canopy as viewed from above. So when you zoom out, when your trees disappear, there they go, there's still a canopy left. And that looks okay. It's not blended very well, and there's a big problem. Sometimes you get these, like, I don't know if I can replicate it, but some blobs appear before others. I wouldn't suggest doing this way. If you've already done your trees like this, don't stress, it's not a big deal. It looks okay. The trick that I've found that works quite well is to do it the other direction instead. So I'm going to go ahead and erase my trees, fix my chair first, and now I'm going to go in the other direction. So I'm going to start with forest leaf, and I'm going to do what we've done before. I'm going to set it to a fairly low amount, maybe not quite as low as we normally get, low hardness, and I'm just going to paint in places where I want trees. And you can see the height data is there. which I actually don't think is a good thing in this case, but there are some blobs that come out first, but that's okay. I kind of like that. We can work with that. So I'm going to paint in where I want these trees, and I might want to surround this farmland with a bit of trees. I think that'll look good. Connect it to this valley. Maybe we'll have some trees down here. And some trees over around here. Yeah, that'd be good. They're a bit horizontally biased, but that's fine. Once we have this down, now it's super easy for us to go ahead, select our tree tool, do a small size that we're used to doing, oops, and then trace. You just trace where that texture has provided you with trees. It doesn't have to be perfect. You know, those two trees, for example, aren't on a splotch. That tree isn't on a splotch. But what you'll see is, let me go ahead and finish this. That needs a little bit more tree. Now, when I look at it from here, looks great. You don't even see the bottom, that tree canopy, because there's trees over it. But when I zoom out, barely changes. You can see the trees disappear, but they're in exactly the same place as when you zoom out. It blends a lot nicer too, I think, because we did that same method of building things up slowly. And yeah, I think that just looks a lot nicer. So that's how we do trees. Hills, you probably saw during the time lapse what I like to do with hills. First of all, hills are not always pure rock. In fact, most of the time, hills are not pure rock. I mostly go a little bit heavy on the rock just for gameplay purposes so that you can really see that they're hills. But we don't want them to be strictly rock. So I build up my hills usually by slathering on quite a bit of hill texture. Let's find a new hill for me to work on. Ooh, let's do this. This probably needs a bit of height map work, but whatever. We're gonna stick with it. So I slather on quite a bit of. I'll do over here as well. Quite a bit of hill texture. Maybe a bit of the hill rock small, just to give it a bit of variation. And then I go over it with a greenery brush, like the Hill 01. I think that looks really nice. And that fills in the hills beautifully, I think. And it leaves us with nice outcroppings of rock, which we can easily blend away. In this case, yeah, so I think that looks really good. Now, there's also this coastline cliff gray texture, which I think, maybe I only think this because it's called coastline cliff, but I think it looks really good for those really steep drops. So what I do is when I have a steep drop like this one, paint that in. And that just gives it a little bit of extra oomph, a little bit of extra verticality on those steeper parts. You can also rotate your camera around to get the sun to be, I guess, what does that, due north, which helps kind of see where your actual cliffs are. I use it a ton, as you probably noticed, around the edges of craters, because the edges of craters are usually very steep. Probably not going to be so relevant on your mod unless you're doing something else based on a celestial body. But you will use that quite a bit. If I was doing, this ridge right here, yeah, I might really bring in that cliff texture to give it a little bit of extra verticality. Okay, those are hills. We've done forests. Now, rivers. I don't think I have any rivers that I have yet to paint. Do I? Sure. Yeah, let's do this one. This is in a very, very work in progress part of the map, as I'm sure you can tell. But let's say that we had some farmlands around this river. So we paint those in. Okay, cool. The problem is it just looks a bit interrupted, right? They don't blend together. Now my rivers are going to look a little bit different than your rivers. I've applied some graphical settings to make my mod look a bit more unique, but it just doesn't really, the farm ends too abruptly. So a trick that you can use for your rivers, I just think this looks pretty good, is using either Beach 01 or Beach 02 pebbles. Let's do Beach 02. Bring that down to the lowest size I can. I'll just do this. Scale up once, so hold control and then scroll up just once, so that's size 2. Give it a hardness of about somewhere around 50%, an amount of 1. I know I said never use amount greater than, 0.3 or whatever, but in this case, 1 works. And then you're going to really sloppily trace the river. I think I did that a little bit too sloppily, actually. I'm going to do that again. Not too sloppily, but you want to trace the river without being too precise. And what you get is these nice, uneven sort of river banks that I think look really good. Beach 02 Pebbles is also a very solid idea. We'll just show what that looks like. Maybe here. It got a little bit more texture to it. I think Beach 02 Pebbles looks even better if you do either a lower hardness or just go down to size 1 and then up your hardness. You'll get a little bit of extra texture around that river, and it just helps it blend in nicer to your surroundings. Alright, last but hopefully not least are shores. You can certainly just paint your shores, with the grass going all the way up to it. In some places that's probably pretty realistic. In some places your shore just being rocky is actually, there are plenty of shores where it is just a cliff that goes straight into the sea. If you want a sandy beach, you have I would say 3, maybe 4 options realistically for your sand textures. Beach 02, great choice, highly recommended. Beach 02 Pebbles, it depends. If it's a stylistic thing, sure, go for it. It's a little bit too rough for me. Beach 02 Mediterranean, great choice. There is also another one called Desert 01/Beach. I don't like it. I think it's personally too fluorescent. But if you're either doing an actual desert beach, or you're doing something like really high fantasy and you want a lot of contrast, it might work for you. Play around with it. But I'm going to go ahead and I think for this area I'll do Beach 02 Mediterranean. Now, a trick for nice beaches is to use a pretty darn high size and an amount of 1 again. Hardness 0, high size, amount 1. And what you can do is you can start in the ocean, so click in the ocean and then just bring it up to the shore, and eventually you'll start seeing it appear. There it is on the shore. And I think that usually results in a really nice, so I'm going to go and look up here. I think that results in a really nice, well-blended beach, I think. Now, it doesn't work when you get into these smaller inlets. You see, if I tried the same thing here, I'm basically just, actually that worked decently, but I erased this whole, I don't know, whatever that is, sandbar. When you get into smaller inlets like this, or over here especially, I could never do that over here. It would just nuke it. So you might want to go smaller. Don't be afraid to really get in. It's actually okay, I should say, to go too far in. So this might look like an absolute disaster, but again, as we've seen, it's all about building up layers. Once you've done this, why not go ahead and find a new thing that might look good here? Maybe Northern Plains could look here. Give it a decently small size, amount really low, and then just bring it back to the coast. I actually don't think Northern Plains and that beach texture blend particularly well together, so I'm going to Control-Z that. I'm going to switch to Medi Grass, which I know blends quite well with that. Give it a decently small size, and see? Not a big deal. Not a big deal that I went overboard, because I can just bring it back to the coast. And that is the magic of layers with small amounts. And there we go. Pretty nice coast. Like I said, don't be afraid of ending your coasts in hills, or especially this coast cliff. What is this? Coastline cliff gray. I think that's very realistic. You don't need beaches absolutely everywhere, and indeed in vanilla there are not beaches absolutely everywhere. But there we have it. So I think it's not perfect, but I think that's a pretty good looking painted terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and drop a link for the Discord for my mod in the discussion if you would like to see more of Tharsis Rising. This continent is called the Tharsis Rise, so it's a bit of a pun. And if you'd like, go ahead and join us. You can message me on Discord if you have any questions. I'm usually online chatting, or feel free to ask questions in the comments, and I will hopefully get back to you. But I hope you learned something, and thanks for sticking with me. Good luck.